Welcome, everybody. I'm Representative Drew Stokesbury from the 31st District and the House Minority Leader. Good to see everybody in person. I don't think we've seen you all in person like this since 2020, so it has been a while. Appreciate it. To my right, I have my Deputy Republican Leader, Mike Steele. I think for both of us, this is the first time we've done one of these media availabilities in our new leadership capacities. I'll turn it over to my Senate counterpart, Senator Braun, in just a second, but I just wanted to highlight one or two things. I don't know if anybody had a chance to catch my remarks yesterday on the first day of session, but I think they paint a much different picture than the picture that Governor Inslee tried to paint today. That's understandable. It is his record that is sort of on trial. I don't think it's a particularly good record. He said the state of our state is stronger than ever. I think the statistics belie that quite clearly. We have the fewest police officers per capita. We are between number 1 and number 3 for violent crime, property crime, auto theft in the country. 70% of our K-12 students are failing math standards. 50% are failing reading standards. The number of fentanyl deaths last year increased in Washington State by more than they increased in any other state, according to the CDC. We have the fewest housing units per household, according to the Lieutenant Governor's own report. We have between the highest and second or third highest gas prices in the country, depending on what day of the week you're measuring. We have 65% of Washington families unable to access child care. So by any metric you want to pick, there is a growing catalog of crises facing the state, the vast majority of which have gotten significantly worse during the last 12 years when Jay Inslee was governor. So I understand why he would want to deflect away from that, but I think the facts belie his arguments today. And our job as House and Senate Republicans is going to be proposing ideas that will actually fix those problems. So my speech yesterday and what I'll be spending the next 59 legislative days working on is talking to my colleagues, talking to the people of Washington, pointing out that it's time for a change and it's time to fix Washington. So with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Senator Braun.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. John Braun, State Senator for the 20th, and good fortune to serve as the leader for the Senate Republican caucus, joined by Senator Judy Warnick and Senator Nikki Torres. I'll also make just a few comments, and we'll jump right into questions. And they're going to echo much of what Representative Stokesbury said. You know, we're focused on the things that we hear from folks in our district, and they really haven't changed because we really haven't solved the problem that most folks are struggling with. It's public safety, and Drew shared a number of statistics with you. We are breaking records, but not in a good way. We continue to break our homicide record. We continue to break records when it comes to property crime, retail theft, automobile theft. We're headed in the wrong direction, and we know that some of the policies put in place over the last couple of years by the current majorities are causing that problem. We can do something about this, and we're refusing to do something about it. But it goes beyond just crime. We also, it's unsafe in the presence of drugs. We continue to break records with fentanyl deaths. We have a homelessness problem that's growing out of this and among the worst in the nation. So we have a lot of challenges there, a lot of work to do to improve it. The next priority for us is affordability. And this cuts across many areas, whether it's food or gas, housing, child care, health care. These are all increasingly unaffordable for the working Washingtonian around the state, and they're getting worse. And this is in spite of the fact that we've seen significant growth in wages over the last few years. We're not keeping up with inflation. We're not keeping up with the regulatory changes that are making it more expensive here in our state. Of course, the top of mind for most people right now is the Climate Commitment Act, because it's very obvious. Most folks can't afford an electric car. When they show up at the gas station, they have to pay an extra 50 cents to $1 per gallon, especially if you're in a border community where you see it so obviously. And down in my neck of the woods, you can drive across the bridge to Oregon and find fuel for $1 less. It's plain as day. And the only difference is the Climate Commitment Act here in Washington that is driving fuel up. And it's very frustrating to the average Washingtonian. I understand that we're working on climate change and we want to address carbon issues, but I don't think here in the great state of Washington that we need to do it on the backs of working Washingtonians. And then finally, we have a lot of work to do to build a better future for our children. We spent the last couple of years talking a lot about our K-12 public education system, the learning loss that many kids suffered during the pandemic. And we know today that while some kids have gotten back on track, particularly kids who were already had some sort of challenge, whether it was economic or academic or social emotional challenge, who were already having difficulty before the pandemic, they are not responding. In particular, children of color and children living in poverty are not recovering at the rate I think we would all want them to. We have a lot more work to do there, but it goes beyond that. We're having trouble, I mentioned, with the cost of child care, but also access to child care that Drew mentioned. And beyond that, into our juvenile criminal justice system, which is failing children who have committed a crime, been convicted. They have to have a sentence to fulfill, but we want to send them out better prepared for a better future, and we are absolutely failing to do that today. So we have a lot of work to do on addressing public safety, on making Washington affordable, and really building a better future for the children of the state of Washington. So once again, thank you for being here, and we look forward to your questions. No questions. Okay, thank you.
Call for one or two things. I'm interested in the Democrats' two bills to do a change in the Constitution to change the 60% on passing school bonds to a simple majority. What is your caucus's position on it? And why? And I'm asking you, I used to work for a daily paper in Washington, the Tri-City Herald, and there was a heck of a lot of school bonds that passed they had like 55 to 57% of the voters were for them, and they still couldn't get them passed. So I am asking you from that perspective.
Okay.
Do you want to? Yeah. Mike he used to be capital budget lead, so I'll let him handle this.
Yeah, I would just say, as the capital budget lead, it's a much more nuanced question than just policy. When we look at our budget realities in this state, we are strapped for cash usually when it comes to the capital budget. We're working right now inside the capital budget committee to address school construction in meaningful ways, both caucuses. And as everybody's aware, we passed the capital budget usually unanimously in both the House and the Senate because it's a compromised budget that works together to solve the problems facing all of our communities. We just don't have capacity. If every school district across Washington decided to run a simple majority or a 55% majority bond, we would be strapped for cash. We would do nothing but pay for K-12 education construction in the capital budget. And we have other obligations in universities, state agencies across the state that have facility needs, and we can't just solely focus on K-12. That said, we recognize it as a problem. Both caucuses, both sides of the aisle recognize it as a problem, and we need to address it, and we're working diligently to do it.
Okay, I'll come at you this way. Republicans love local control. That's one of your basic fundamental values. Why not just leave it up to the local school districts and whether they want to tax themselves?
Well, it is up to the local school districts. It requires them. The Constitution requires them to get a supermajority. And that's been that way for a long time. And the simple answer is we're asking voters to pay for a school bond for 20 to 30 years. Just a long-term commitment. It is not unreasonable and certainly not unprecedented to look around the country to ask for a supermajority to make sure that everybody is on board. One of the most challenging things folks are facing in our communities around the state, and it's particularly true in rural communities, is the cost of property taxes. It continues to go up, and it's driving the cost of housing, whether it's owned housing or rented housing, up and up. This is so you're proposing, when a bond measure comes up, and I might add that most bond measures do pass with over 60%, but some don't. You're absolutely right. Some don't.
Just the ones I covered.
And by the way, most of the ones that don't are in rural Washington, so we're very familiar with the challenge. But the answer is not to change the standard. The answer is to build a better case for the voters. Make them believe you're going to get, if they approve that bond, you're going to do something that will really make a difference. I live in the city of, just outside the city of Centralia. We failed, I think, 4 bonds before they finally passed one. But when they first did it, they did not have a plan on how they're going to do it. And the voters paid attention. They said, we don't understand how you're going to spend this money and how it's going to benefit us over the next 3 decades. Once they took the time to understand, to educate the voters, to build consensus, they passed the bond and they remodeled and rebuilt 3 schools. So this is absolutely doable. On top of that, we're doing a lot inside the capital budget we didn't talk about to help schools who are still having struggles. So there's a lot of things going on here. But I don't think the answer is simply to change the rules. The answer is to go out, communicate with the public, help them understand what your plan is, that you will spend their money wisely, and then I think you'll get support. And in my district, we've seen that happen over and over again, where bonds have failed and where they slowed down, taken their time, communicated with the public, they've come back and passed them.
And I'd like to say that same thing, because I represented a rural area too, Central Washington. We've had the same thing. We've had bonds fail. But people that we represent, people that the school board members talk to, want to make it difficult to raise taxes. And they want to make sure that what they are voting for is exactly what the community needs. So I've heard that over and over. Make it difficult to raise taxes and prove the point. Prove why you need that school bond.
And as a matter of fact, we hold ourselves to the same account at the legislature. We don't pass the capital budget without a supermajority to pay for the 30-year bonds. So we don't have a separate standard. We require a minority-majority coalition to pass the capital budget.
The Constitution contains a number of provisions to avoid tyranny of the majority when it comes to taxation, especially property taxes. They are limited to $1 to 1% essentially, and property taxes have to be uniform. And so when a bond passes, that is going to go above and beyond the 1% limitation in the state constitution. So as a matter of fairness and to avoid this tyranny of the majority, the Constitution requires a 60% supermajority. So to Senator Braun's point, it's not unreasonable to say that schools and districts need to do a better job making the case to voters. You're right, John, there are some districts that, fail a bond with just over 50%, but there's plenty more that fail it well below 50. My district in Enumclaw failed a bond with just less than 1/3 voting yes. They retained their whole school board, but they opposed the bond by nearly a 2-to-1 margin. It's up to voters to decide these things. We have 60,000 students that have left the K-12 education system since COVID. There is a profound lack of trust by a lot of families in their public school system. And so I think our job as policymakers and the job of school districts in concert with us is to help better make the case for why those investments are worthy. And if a district can't make the case, they shouldn't obligate taxpayers to 30 years of funding.
The governor mentioned his hopes for the session, the constitutional amendment to protect abortion rights. Democratic leadership just said, we have the bandwidth, we have the bill, we have the votes, but we need bipartisan support. Any members of your Congress willing to, your caucus willing to vote for that?
Well, I heard Senator Billick's answer. It was a little interesting because I was at a pre-session forum with him in Spokane and talking about a different bill. He said that we didn't need to waste time on bills that simply repeated existing rights. So I think it's a little curious that he has a different standard for topics he disagrees with than he does for topics he agrees with. I think we ought to take a little bit more of a consistent approach there. But in my mind, I think that the constitutional amendment is superfluous. Abortion rights aren't under threat in Washington. The only people saying they are Democrats who think it's politically advantageous for them to do so. I don't have any members of my caucus that are looking to run bills to curtail a woman's right to choose, and I don't anticipate that changing over the next 60 days. Constitutional right, the right to an abortion has been enshrined in state statute since a voter initiative in the 1970s. They were expanded in the early 1990s, and there's never been any meaningful effort to curtail them in the past, and I don't anticipate one to happen in the future. There's a reason why we pass bills when we want to do something and not put everything in the Constitution. So until somebody can demonstrate to me why these rights are somehow under threat, I don't think it's a valuable use of the legislature's time to constitutionalize everything that we think is a good idea. We would be here forever.
I have a question about REIT. I'm wondering what the appetite is in your guys' caucuses for a new bill this year. I know that there's a proposal that just dropped I think, today that would decrease REIT for properties under 700,000 and then impose a new transfer tax for properties over, I think, around 3 million. Like that, when some of that new funding would go toward affordable housing, which you guys have already said is kind of a big need this year.
Yeah, I would say two things. I don't think there's going to be support in our caucus for that, for the simple reason that this continues to add, additional taxes to a population that already thinks they're overtaxed. And you can say, well, none of us are buying houses greater than $3 million, and that's certainly true. It's also true that almost all the multifamily housing out there in all of our communities is more than $3 million. So every transfer that happens to those type of properties, that increase the cost and is ultimately going to increase the rent. So we don't think there's a need for more revenue. I think most fundamentally, but two, don't think this is the right way to do it. This is one that once again adds cost to working families who are already having trouble making ends meet.
You can't make housing more affordable by making it more expensive. I mean, it's as simple as that for Republicans. And to Senator Braun's point, yes, there's not a lot of folks who need affordable housing that are buying $3 million single-family homes, but that will absolutely hit almost every multifamily housing complex in the state. So, and I'll also point out that lowering the rate for $700,000 might be great in a lot of parts of the state, but that won't do you much in King County. My community in South Auburn is full of homes that were $200,000-$300,000 8 years ago and are $700,000 to $800,000 today.
Wow. Yeah.
Listening to your speech yesterday, listening to the Republican response today, you guys are painting a pretty depressing picture of life in Washington. And it feels like in the short session and with the elections lying ahead, that a lot of what you guys are doing is literally trying to scare people to vote out Democrats and vote in ours. So what is that a goal? Is that why? Is there anything positive in Washington? Why are you guys so depressing?
Well, I don't feel that depressed actually. So not to take that personally, but hey, look, we're not painting. We're not out. We don't wake up in the morning and say, hey, I think I'll go paint a depressing picture of what's going on in Washington. What you've heard us talk about is the stats, whether it's the increase in homicides in our state, or the increase in property crime, or the increase, the failure of 2 out of 3 of our children to pass reading and arithmetic at grade level. We're simply sharing with the public that we're going in the wrong direction, and our belief is that we're going in the wrong direction because of policies put in place by the Democratic majorities. That's our job as the loyal minority, is to point out when they got it wrong, and we think they've gotten it wrong nearly across the board. What else would you expect us to do? Now, I want to be clear, in most of these cases, we're also proposing policies that would make it better. We're not just saying, hey, it's wrong, oh, too bad. We're saying, hey, it's wrong, why don't you try something different? So in every one of these cases, I think we could talk about specific policy that says we can make it better for the state of Washington. We can make it better for you and your family if you give us a chance.
Well, and I can tell you, too, as someone who has a very unique legislative district, probably the most unique district in all of Washington. As folks know, I represent part of Douglas County, Allentown County, part of King, and part of Snohomish County. So I'm the only legislative district that crosses the Cascade Mountain Range. And I would just say, over my time in the legislature, what we're talking about more often than not is urban versus rural issues. And when you look at the issues that we're talking about, they disproportionately affect the folks who live in rural Washington more. I mean, we have to travel farther, have smaller police forces, have to think about the cost of just doing basic business every day, where your kids are going to go to school, whether or not their schools are falling down around them. Those are things that face rural Washington disproportionately more than they do urban Washington. So it's about telling that story. And if it sounds bleak, well, maybe it is to some communities, because we're working really hard to grapple for what the urban communities already have. And I think that's an important point to make, that this urban-rural divide is real in Washington, and all the time we talk about one Washington, but we really don't mean it. And I can see it very, very clearly in my district now. When I represent rural parts of King County, they feel left out of the rest of King County. So it's a very real thing, and I think it's important that we continue to point that out.
I think the statistics that I shared yesterday, Jerry, I mean, they do paint a very sobering picture. But as I also pointed out, those of us who are serving down here wouldn't be serving down here if we didn't think we could help and we didn't think there's a way to fix Washington. If we thought there was no hope, we would pack our bags and move to Idaho if you like the snow and Florida if you like the sun. But we're not doing that. We're sacrificing time away from our families to come down to Olympia to try to fix things. And if you listen to some of the stuff we've talked about, almost to a T, every issue where we've been talking about represents areas where Democrats have forged ahead and pursued policies on a single party basis. We've not really complained very much about the things that have been done on a bipartisan basis. There's lots of good when things happen bipartisanly. Mike alluded to the capital budget a minute ago. I think I was reasonably pleased by the progress we made in response to the Blake decision in the special session bill last year. Working families tax cut, which is something that Andy Billig mentioned, would not have happened without House Republicans pushing for it. So I think there's a lot of good that can be had when there's bipartisanship, and I pointed that out in my speech yesterday too. That we shouldn't have so much hubris as to think that only one party has the answer to everything. But the things that I think are really going wrong when it comes to like the high price of gas due to the Climate Commitment Act have to do, those come about when Democrats have passed bills on a single party basis. So I think there's plenty of stuff to be hopeful about in Washington, and we wouldn't be down here if we didn't think there was a way to do it. But there is a lot going wrong, and our job as part of the loyal opposition is to propose ideas to fix Washington, and that's what we're going to do for the next 59 days.
I have a question about rent control. Sounds like that's got some momentum. Your concerns about that bill, leadership?
Yeah, we continue to think we can undercut the market housing and succeed in this problem, and we can't. Look, depends on who you ask, but regardless of who you ask, we put a record amount of money into public housing last year during the longer session. Whether it's $600 million or I think some folks are saying $1 billion now. It depends on how you count it up. But the reality is, you can do the simple math. If each house, and I granted all of our houses is $400,000, $1 billion doesn't go very far, and it's not all focused on that. We can't, and we're almost 300,000 homes behind. We can't get there by the state, buying or building, and hopefully affordable housing. The numbers simply don't work to get there. We need to build somewhere on the order of 20, 30, 40, 50,000 homes per year to get there. To do that, you need folks to invest in housing in Washington. They won't do that if they have rent control hanging over their heads. They simply won't. Now, you can like rent control, you don't like rent control, but if you want more housing, and more housing is what drives the price down. If you want more housing, you have to create a regulatory environment that will attract big investment in housing in the state of Washington. That's what fixes the problem long term, and that's why we're not looking for higher rents. We're just looking for a problem that will actually play out to the end and result in enough housing for everyone at an affordable price.
I agree with everything that Senator Braun said. I would just make the analogy that I think rent control is a Band-Aid solution. It might work for a few years, but won't do anything to, over the long term, on a permanent basis, lower the price of housing. I think we got to think a lot bigger than that, and that means building more housing of all types. But we build more housing, and that will lower the price. So we shouldn't think small potatoes and worry about capping the rate at which rent can increase. We should think big and figure out ways to incentivize building more housing to actually bring down rents. And like Senator Braun pointed out, rent control will have the opposite effect of that. It will dry up investment capital for housing, and you'll be stuck in an endless spiral of never increasing rent prices because we won't ever be able to build the supply we need to get out of being dead last in housing units per household in the state.
I have a question on some of the climate policy. You guys mentioned earlier that it shouldn't be done on the backs of working class Americans. And so I was just curious on where you think the funding for the climate policy should come from. Like, should it come from wealthy people, or where do you anticipate the funding to come for climate change policy?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues there. First of all, I address the regressivity issue. And you saw, even when the Climate Commitment Act passed a couple years ago, you saw some, I think, some Democrats who stuck with their principles who voted against it for that very reason. It's a very regressive tax. In essence, it's a very regressive tax. And folks like to talk about the regressive nature of the tax system in the state of Washington. When you actually look at the studies that have done on that, what you learn is that gas tax, and therefore the Climate Commitment Act, which acts as essentially a large gas tax, is the most regressive thing in our tax system. So why would we say, hey, we want to help the folks in the middle? Why would we do that and then lay over the top of them a very regressive system? So that's the first issue. That's why it's just the wrong answer. Here we are in the state of Washington. We think we're innovative. We have fabulous companies that have innovated, and yet our solution is not innovative at all. Let's just take more money from folks across Washington, percentage-wise more from working Washingtonians, and then we think we can spend it better than them. Just fundamentally a bad idea. The second part of your question, like, where would the money come from? I would disagree with that at its premises. I don't think that we need a big pot of money that Jay Inslee or the Democratic majority is in charge of to fix climate change. That's a fundamentally false notion. We can do this better ways. We can do this more innovatively. We can do this without additional government oversight. And there's simple examples where you see we have 8 million people in our state now, and every one of them are making better choices when it comes to how they emit carbon. I think that's a much, much more powerful way to have success than to legislate it. Let's empower people to make good decisions about how they live, and I believe they will. I mean, we don't have organic cereal in the grocery store or non-GMO food in the grocery store because we told them it had to be there. It's there because people want it. People want to make better decisions about their lives, their environment, their families, etc. Let's empower them to do so. Let's be innovative. And we have a great example that just happened this last year right here in the legislature, a bipartisan example, where we looked at the aviation industry, where they decided today we can't make an electric airplane. We can't figure out how to do it. Let's think of another more innovative way to make our aviation industry carbon neutral. So they build a technology that literally, the idea is it captures carbon from different sources, builds hydrocarbons, builds jet fuel, flies planes that emit carbon, captures more carbon, so that long term it is carbon neutral. In its scale, it is competitive with the current market, and you don't have to put this overwhelming press of taxes and additional cost on people across the state of Washington. Why aren't we looking for solutions like that? That's a better way. That's what we should be doing in the state of Washington.
The other thing is, with that, I represent a very rural area, a lot of agriculture. And while the Climate Commitment Act was being proposed, it was promised that the agricultural exemption would stay, the tax exemption for agricultural products, for agricultural users would stay, and it has not. So it's cost our farmers, cost our agricultural producers a tremendous amount of money, and we in the agricultural field have more of a chance of creating carbon neutral products, a situation, plus the food that Senator Braun was talking about. So there was a promise made that has not been kept for our ag producers. So that's one of the, again, what I hear from my constituents, my farmer constituents, why are they doing that to us? So.
Senator Braun or Senator Stokes-Barrett, both of you have stated a desire for Washington to move towards the middle of the pack in terms of police officers per capita. The governor is opening regional training centers Are there other steps you think could be done to both recruit and retain police officers in the state?
Yeah, I mean, I have always been supportive of this idea of regional academies, and it was great to meet somebody in the gallery that has benefited from that. But that is barely a nick in solving the problem. very, I mean, it makes things a little bit easier, but I've yet to meet a police chief or sheriff that said the problem is only because we can't convince folks to spend a few months away at a training across state. So that isn't really getting at the core of the problem. It's not nice. I think that we got to help these cities and counties with more money. We gave a lot more money to the State Patrol a couple years ago to increase trooper pay because they were suffering from some of these same recruitment and retention issues. We need to do the same thing for local governments. So I think there's about 3 ways I've seen to do it. Senator Holy has a bill, and I think Representative Wallen, a Democrat, has a very similar bill this session that would essentially give that money to cities and counties based on a local sales tax credit. There is a bill that I introduced last session that would just, say this should be a priority of the state operating budget that has doubled in the past 10 years, and we should just give grant money to cities and counties to do it. The third option is one that I think Representative Couture from my caucus has proposed a bill on, which would increase indigent defense funding for counties, which they need, but tie it to ensuring that they have minimum policing ratios as well. So a couple different ways you could do it. I'd be good with pretty much any of them. Maybe there's other ways too, but I think we got to give cities and counties money to be able to fund this and make it a priority for them. The harder, longer-term approach is, we've got to change the culture surrounding law enforcement in this state. Some of the bills that were passed in 2021 and 2022, well-intentioned as they were, I think really caused a significant problem, not just in terms of public safety, but also in terms of these police departments' ability to, have a quality force. It is really tough to be a police officer. It always has been, and these laws make it even harder to stay in the profession. There are countless families that are leaving the profession. My own former seatmate, Representative Irwin, was a Seattle police officer, and he quit the legislature because he thought he would rather be a cop than be a legislator. He said, legislature is the greatest job I've ever had in my life, except for being a cop. He's now no longer a police officer 3 years later. Because that's how hard it is to do this profession. And these laws that we have passed make it even harder. And even a lot of Democrats understand this too. Alicia Rule has a bill that would roll back the pursuit law. So we need to have a longer term conversation about the how we treat police officers and how the legislature manages public safety issues and whether or not that's contributing towards us being last in the nation, and I think it is, and I think that's part of why folks up here in our caucuses would support changing the police pursuit law, changing some of these other rules that we passed in the last couple of years to make law enforcement a more desirable profession where the good cops aren't always made out to be bad guys.
Time for one more question.
Let me jump in on that if I may. And I don't have a lot to add to that. That was a very comprehensive answer. And very simply, it's about training, it's about recruiting, it's about funding. I've been encouraged. We heard the governor say today. I've heard the leaders in the House and the Senate on the Democratic side talk about growing our law enforcement out of several events over the last couple of weeks. So I'm encouraged by that. That's something we've been talking about for a couple of years. You mentioned our Senator Holy's bill to offer a state credit against the state sales tax. That bill's been out there for 2 years now. This is its third year, and just now we're starting to get some interest. So I think when it comes to training, the regional criminal justice training centers, I'm a little bit more positive about that than Representative Stokesbury. But either way, that's a step in the right direction. Very bipartisan effort to make that happen. During the last session, I think that the other side of the aisle is starting to come along with the idea that it's going to take more money, and they do. I heard the speaker say this earlier, and I think she's right. First we need to fill up the already funded local positions, but we need to be prepared to add additional positions once those are filled, and then the hardest part, the part that we're not there with yet, is the recruiting and the real challenges with getting our best and brightest to choose a career in law enforcement today have to do with how we have painted law enforcement as a society over the last few years, not particularly positive. And kind of how we're going to judge them. Now, nobody disagrees. Not Republicans, not Democrats disagree that we need well-trained, well-supervised, and accountable law enforcement. I don't think I've yet to find the person that doesn't agree with that. The challenge is when you hold them accountable, how are you holding them accountable? And right now, most law enforcement officers who are in the profession don't feel like they're getting a fair shake. And in particular, the rule, kind of all the changes that happened in 2021, one of the ones that was in there was where they changed the standard from a reasonable officer standard to a reasonable person standard. And it sounds very reasonable, no pun intended, but it's not reasonable, because what you have is you have officers trained very specifically how they respond in a dangerous situation. They're trained to be very proactive when they think that either themselves, their coworkers, or the public are going to be threatened by someone who might do something. They're trained to be proactive and take action to prevent that from happening. That's intentional and has been proven to reduce the level of violence. The average person doesn't know that. They haven't gotten this training. So the reasonable person standard that they're now judged by has no idea how they were actually trained. That's not a fair way to judge people. We don't take doctors and say, hey, we know you went through 12 years of school, but we're going to bring in a reasonable patient to tell you whether you did a good job or not. That would not be fair. It wouldn't be fair for attorneys. It wouldn't be fair for all kinds of professions who have very specific training. We've created an unfair situation for our law enforcement, and I understand we want them held accountable. Nobody disagrees with that, but we have to treat them fair. If we're going to recruit folks into the law enforcement profession, and we desperately need to, we're the worst in the country, and we don't have to be the top in the country, but we at least ought to be in the middle. If we're going to recruit folks into that profession, we have to give them a fair deal, and we're not right now.
Thank you, everyone.